song that we open with, there will be storms. And I wish I could tell you as a person who's been following Jesus for over 25 years that, you know what, at some point those questions and doubts go away. And at some point the waters just get really smooth. But that is not the case. That's not the case. And yet we're called to walk toward our storm. Jesus gives the disciples a heading, go in the boat and go to the other side. And then all hell breaks loose, literally. The story says this next. When evening came, he was there alone. Jesus was there alone. But the boat by this time was a long way from land, beaten by the waves, for the wind was against them. There's an interesting choice of words here. Beaten by the waves. The word there is buffeted, or it could be translated tormented by the waves. And almost every other time that word tormented is used in the Bible, it's used to describe demonic activity coming against what God wants done in a person. And so we can actually say this storm wasn't just a potential natural catastrophe, but there were supernatural forces involved to try to create an environment where the disciples literally would not make it to the other side. And I think if I could sit down with many of you in here, you'd say that's exactly how I feel. I feel tormented. I feel buffeted. I feel beaten. Beaten by the heading that God has given me because I know it's going to be difficult. Beaten by the situation I'm already in. Beaten by a bad diagnosis. Beaten and buffeted by the things that are already happening in my life. And I want to tell you something. Jesus got his disciples to go toward that heading, and he knew there would be a storm. Interesting, he left that out. He didn't tell them that, but he knew there'd be a storm. And yet, even though Jesus sends you in the direction of a storm, doesn't mean he causes the storm. It doesn't mean he causes the storm. We live in a broken world. We live in a world where we will face resistance, especially when we're pursuing things that God has ordained. That's just reality. But the great news is Jesus does not leave you alone in a storm. He's with you in the midst of the storm. Because the story goes on to say this, in the fourth watch of the night, this is after 6 hours, guys. They've been buffeted by these waves for 6 hours. It's now the fourth watch of the night, between 3 and 6 in the morning. It says, Jesus came to them walking on the sea. Now put yourself in the story. It's dark. And I mean, it's like, crazy waves and wind beating you, rain coming. And all of a sudden in the distance, you think you see a figure walking on the sea. How would you respond? If you're honest, you'll respond like the disciples do. It says, when the disciples saw him walking on the sea, they were terrified. Parentheses, their incontinence was challenged. Their continence was challenged. And they said, it's a ghost. And they cried out in fear. But immediately Jesus spoke to them saying, take heart, it is I. Do not be afraid. Man, this is really rich. I love that Jesus meets the disciples in the middle of the storm. At the point at which I'm sure they thought, does Jesus even know we're here? He meets them, walking on the sea. Walking on the sea. They freak out because they think it's a ghost. And one of the beliefs they had back then was, if you see a ghost on the water in the middle of a storm, you're about to be a ghost because of the water and the storm. Like, that's what they thought. So they were like, this is an omen of doom. And Jesus knows that. He sees their fear, and I love what he does. Jesus is communicating in very clear terms his authority over the storm. He does that both physically by what he does and by what he says. And I don't want you guys to miss this. Physically, Jesus is walking on the sea. And one of the beliefs, again, that ancients had was that the sea was a place of chaos. It was untamable. It was the place where the gods dwell, and the gods are angry, and they will swallow you alive. That's part of the belief system that went into why they would be so afraid to be in the middle of a sea in a storm. And so the fact that Jesus is literally treading on the heads of the evil, chaotic storm and the gods that cause them is a powerful statement that he has authority over the sea and over the wind, and over the waves, and over this storm. Jesus is communicating something to these men. But the other thing is he communicates that through his words. Because what they would have heard is not take heart, it is I, because obviously Jesus wasn't speaking English to them. So what they would have heard is take heart, I am. Take heart, Yahweh. Which immediately in the mind of a Jewish person would have taken them back thousands of years to Mount Sinai, where God came to Moses at a burning bush and said, I have heard the cries of my people and I'm going to rescue them from Pharaoh. You go to Pharaoh and tell him to let my people go. And Moses says, Pharaoh's a pretty powerful guy. Can you at least tell me what your name is so when I tell him this God has sent me, I have a name? And the name that God gave Moses, it's a name that to this day Jews do not utter, is the word Yahweh, I am. So Jesus is not only treading on the heads of the gods, but he's saying to his disciples and to us, take heart, I am is on the water. Yahweh is on the water. Yahweh is in your storm. Yahweh is in control. That's what he's saying. That's what he's saying. Now, knowing that it's God in control on the water, how would you respond? Now, before you get too happy clappy, let's be clear. We've got a focus group of 12 that's pretty indicative of how we'd respond. See, the truth is, even after Jesus says, take heart, it is I, Yahweh on the water, God is on the water with you, 11 of the 12 people still stay in the boat. Which leads to another question. Were they any safer on the boat? No. Still getting the wind whipped in their face. Rain is still pummeling them. The ship could potentially capsize. They are no safer. And so what we need to understand is the boat in this story represents us trying to rely on our own effort in the midst of the storm. And let's be honest, a lot of us would be in that boat. A lot of us are in that boat right now. We're trying to row harder towards the thing, and it's not going to work. It's not going to work. You're no safer in the boat. The boat is not a safer play. And yet that's where most of the people stay. But one person, Peter, makes a brave step forward. It says this, and Peter answered him, Lord, if it is you, command me to come to you on the water. And Jesus said, come. So Peter got out of the boat and walked on the water and came to Jesus. In other words, what Peter was saying here is, Jesus, if that's you, enable me to do what you're doing right now. Enable me to walk on the water. Now, here's the thing. Why in the world did Peter say that? Peter's like this impulsive guy. I love him for that reason. I can relate to him. He's impulsive. I don't know if he got inspired. I don't know what it was. But in the midst of it, he's like, Jesus, if that's you, let me walk on the water. I don't know why he did that. But he did. Maybe he lost a bet. Who knows? But he says, let me walk on the water. And it's interesting because a couple of stories back, a couple of days or months back, as Jesus has been interacting with Peter and the disciples, he asked them a question. He said, who do other people say that I am? And Peter was the first person recorded in the Bible to say, you are the Messiah. You're the Son of the living God. To make that bold declaration. And at that point, Simon, because his name used to be Simon, Jesus said to him, Simon, that's been revealed to you by God, and so I'm changing your name. You're now Rock. And based on that rock, based on that bold confession of faith, I'm going to build my church. I'm going to build water walkers based on that. So I think when Jesus saw that out of all the 12, Peter was the one that said, enable me to do what you were doing. I think Jesus was like, my man, Peter, come on. Come on, brother, it's time. You feel it now, right? Like Jesus was like, he was excited. And he comes. And can you imagine this moment where the waves are capsized? I mean, it's crazy. And Peter does this. And he gets out of the boat. And this moment right here has to be crazy. And he does what no other person has done. And he walks on the water. He walks on the water. And what you need to see is the only difference between Peter and the 11, the only difference between people in here who are going to get a breakthrough and who won't, is that he trusted the God on the water. And he took a brave step. There's one other obvious difference. He walked on water. He walked on, have you walked on water? He walked on water. Talk about the ultimate conversation stopper if you're in a game of 1-up at dinner. How do you top that? And here's the thing. There will be storms, there will be wind, there will be waves, and you will have to face your storm to get to the breakthrough that God has for you, that Jesus is inviting you into. But maybe, just maybe, if you're willing to step out, you'll actually walk on water. So what are you afraid of? What are you afraid of? Name your storm. This week, you're going to name your storm. And maybe the storm is pride. Maybe the storm is unforgiveness. Maybe the storm is laziness. Maybe the storm is anger. Maybe the storm is fear. But whatever it is, if you're not willing to face your storm, you'll miss the breakthrough that God has for you when he gave you that heading. So what's your choice going to be? Will you choose comfort in the boat? Or will you choose growth out on the water? Will you choose to hold that grudge? or will you choose to forgive? Will you choose to stay stuck, which is the definition of insanity, to keep doing the same thing? Or will you move forward? Will you continue to hide? Or will you get vulnerable and potentially experience more freedom than you ever imagined? A friend of mine sent me a sign as I was kind of walking through some brave things in my life, and I go back to it almost like an icon for this journey. It just simply says, adventure awaits. Adventure awaits. And one of the questions we talked about in the groups this week was, how would you define adventure? And for me, adventure is something that takes me to the end of myself and beyond, only to realize that there's actually more to me than I thought I was made of, more to God than I thought was there, and more to the calling He has on my life. That's adventure. And I tell you what, guys, adventure awaits people who get out of the boat. Healing awaits people who get out of the boat. Deliverance awaits people who get out of the boat. Miracles will happen in the lives of people who get out of the boat and face their storm. And here's the thing. As amazing as it is that Peter walked on water, that's not the reason to get out of the boat. The reason to get out of the boat, which strangely escaped me as much as I've read this story and hit me recently, is this. The reason to get out on the boat is because Jesus is on the water. You want Jesus? He's on the water. Jesus is not in your comfort zone. Jesus is not in playing it safe. Jesus is not on you trying to row harder to get through the storm. Jesus is on the water and He's inviting you to come. If you have a heading to see difference in your marriage, Jesus is on the water and He's inviting you to come because He wants that for you. If you have a heading to start a new business, Jesus is on the water inviting you to see how He brings creativity and a team around you to make that happen. If you're trying to break an addiction, I want you to know Jesus is calling you today to step out of the boat and experience redemption, experience community, experience healing. Man, get out of the boat, not only because you might walk on water, but get out of the boat because Jesus is on the water. Amen. He's on the water. He's on the water.